Hi guys, hope you're all doing well. Welcome to this week's workshop, which is on race control and race strategy. This is another topic that was suggested via the Google Forms suggestion box, essentially. So there was quite a few kind of variations on this topic in terms of the questions that were asked. And I think, hopefully, this should be something that kind of brings it all together in some way. So if you ask anything about racing strategy or pacing and things like that, then this is kind of what you were after, hopefully. It's kind of the general theme. So yeah, so we'll run through this. Now this again, kind of one of the core messages here that I'll put out at the start with this one is that, you know, fundamentally it's about trying to keep this simple. And the whole thing is, and actually the first point in the presentation here in the introduction is that, you know, the principles of sound pacing are simplistic. You know, it's like what me and Liam talked about last week with the underwater fly kick and breaststroke pullouts part. You know, it's easy to make topics in sport very complicated when they actually aren't. Now, the process of doing it is hard in terms of the effort required and the focus required. Yes, there is a lot of hard work and complex effort that needs to go into that, but the basic fundamentals are very simple. And hopefully today, I'll give you some understanding of how to approach pacing and, you know, looking at how you put together strategies and then train that as well. Hopefully give some simple things to use. And I think it is probably as simple as it, hopefully, as it could get. So like I said, the principles are simplistic within proper pacing and sound pacing. You know, fundamentally, we need to practice it in training and then apply it in racing. You know, the experimentation ground is the training pool, and then going in there and applying what you've experimented with and learned about yourself is for the racing situation. Okay, there's two kind of base elements to having, you know, to sound strategy and pacing. You know, you've got to make sure firstly you've got to have an actual foundation of a strategy, which I'll deliver during this talk. And then second one is developing the right control over that pacing and that strategy, and I've highlighted this in bold, not in bold, in capital letters, and this happens a couple of times in this presentation, that time is a massive requirement here in terms of learning how to do this properly. You know, you're going to have a lot of times where it doesn't go well, it doesn't go right. You're going to have to learn from that. You're going to have to reflect on your practice and then be patient enough to give it the time it needs for you personally to digest it. For some of you, it might take a short period. Some of it might take years. Who knows? But this is definitely something that you cannot just do with a snap of your fingers. It's got to take a lot of time, and you've got to allow that to happen. In terms of, you know, pacing, control, and strategies, it is a key skill, but can be often overlooked in developing swimmers, so swimmers who are age group and youth level. This topic suffers from a lot of noise and a lot of issues with noise. And what I mean by this, there's a lot of interference, there's a lot of different opinions and this, that, and the other that go around with this. And some examples of that are, you know, you may have found yourself in a position where your coach has said one thing about about strategy and something that they've been implementing within the training sessions, and it's been building towards the competition. And then your mom and dad or a grandparent or whatever may have then said to you something completely opposite, which then throws up a huge interference within what's actually being planned and being developed. Now, not every coach thinks that way, but that's the way I see it. I plan these processes into our program and we try and implement it and integrate it within the training situation. So when it gets to the race, it is there to be used and there to be done properly and well. So from a parent's perspective, if any parents are watching this, it is important to not add in extra noise with suggesting strategies when that might be very contrary to the strategy that is given by the coach or by the team or whatever it is. You know, other athletes bring in interference. Now, a really great example of this, and probably one that we've all seen, I know I've certainly seen it multiple times and even heard about it from you guys, is you'll be stuck behind the blocks or you'll be in the call area or whatever, and a swimmer from another team or another club or whatever will say to you, "Oh, I'm tired. You know, I don't feel good, or I'm probably going to be quite slow in this race," trying to throw you off the scent a little bit, trying to get you to go, "Oh, well, maybe they're going to go out slow," or, you know, someone else might say, "Oh, I'm going to go out I'm just going to go out for this. I'm just going to go out and hold on." Trying to preempt you into thinking, well, I'm going to abandon what I'm going to be doing, which is what we've been practicing, hopefully. and then throwing you into a whole other area where your brain starts going haywire and going, oh, well, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And then fundamentally starting to worry about the things that you can't control, which is the performance of another person. You can only control your own performance. So there's a mental element to this as well. From that perspective is, if you've got a strategy and you practice something and you've worked on controlling the way that you're doing things, then do not let other athletes interfere with that. Even people from your own team, don't let them do that. You do what you practice and what you're planning to do. Multiple coaches is another one. So what I say may be very different to what an original coach has said, or someone else from somewhere different, or in a camp, and this, that, and the other. And there's nothing wrong with having a varying of opinion around you as an athlete. But what's important is that those get brought to one place, and then they can be talked about and go, well, actually, what is the best way of doing this? Because there's no right, it's not about necessarily being right or wrong in terms of opinion on this, but sometimes having multiple coaches or multiple people saying things to you at once, you don't know what to do. You don't know where to go. You don't know which person to listen to. And that can be challenging, which is another level of noise to this. And then the final point there is watching or reading information from elite athletes. Now, I put in the brackets that this is not fundamentally a negative thing. You know, it's not a bad thing to go and research about what elite swimmers do and how they approach things, or what their strategies are, or how they train certain things. But what you've always got to remember is that where an elite athlete is compared to where we are as developing athletes, as age groupers, as youth swimmers, we are not advanced enough, and we are not at their level. You know, if you were to try and swim like Adam Peaty, that would be a bit of a folly, because Adam Peaty structures his race specifically around him and around the strengths that he's developed over many years in the sport. You know, going back 10 years, for example, he wouldn't be performing his race in the exact same manner as he does now. That's taken a lot of time, and it's very bespoke to him. So while it's not a negative thing to look at what the elite athletes are doing, be very careful with it, because you've got to be really honest with yourself about where you sit in that process. It's too easy to go and do really advanced race strategies or think too in depth about it too early. Okay, so that's just hopefully a little introduction to this little bit. So, building our toolbox. Now, I've used this phrase before, or more increasingly anyway, to basically talk about how we acquire skills and build up skills, so then when the time comes, we can use them effectively. So kind of the key point here is, it's like all levels of development, or all areas of development, having skills and knowledge to draw from gives us the opportunity to manage situations more effectively when they happen. You know, and it's called building your toolbox. So the more skills that you develop and you have in your toolbox, when a situation arises, and it may never arise, or it may arise all the time, you have those skills to call upon, you know, mentally and physically, to take them out and go, right, I can use this now, because this is a tool that I know I've used and developed within the training environment and as I've got older. So it's important to understand that you need to have a toolbox. You can't just be a one-size-fits-all or one-dimensional athlete. You've got to have the ability to do varying different things, and be able to deal with varying different situations. So the idea of controlling in strategy is relevant in training, where it's built, which we'll go into in a minute, and racing, where it's applied. You know, teaching of the skill can be done in isolation, so in discussions between myself and you guys, or in little teaching moments within a session, and how it's built into different conversations that we have, or fundamentally integrated with other skills. And that's where it's most effective, where you're looking at building race strategy and control within doing things like start practice or turn practice or race finish practice. Let's just use an example that kind of ties a lot of what I'm going to talk about together. You know, let's just say we want to practice race finishes. Doing something like a set of 475s, building each 25 to an all-out sprint over the last 25. Within that last 15, then doing a proper technical race finish on whatever stroke we're doing. What that creates is a building process where you are emulating how you want to approach going through a swim from 100 meters up anyway, and we'll get to that. And then at the end of it, because you'll be going pretty fast, and there'll be an element of fatigue within that particular repetition, not massive fatigue, but an element of it. Then you will have pressure there to perform that race skill with great technique. And then that way the skill of the race finish is integrated within a little repetition or within a little set. rather than just doing the first example there, just doing race finishes, which is good for learning technique and developing it. But then when you want to integrate it and make it real and perform under some level of pressure, then you can start adding it to sets like that, for example. Okay, so key parts of learning control and strategy when it comes to pacing is learning how to use distance per stroke. Okay, so learning how to hold the water well on your pulling, make sure that you get the maximum amount of propulsion and forward motion out of your pull. Remember, distance per stroke is not about what you do over the water, it's how you generate forward momentum under the water. Okay, so how you pull and how you move through that water and move forwards is part of that great distance per stroke, and obviously having great technique and applying that. The second element is learning how to build, okay, which we'll go into in a minute. So building through swims, which is the most important factor that we're going to talk about here in terms of a simple method of developing proper strategy and proper control of your pacing. Learning how to pace control in training and racing. Now, a quick little story here on this one in understanding how important and how much benefit can be gained from learning how to pace control within a training session. So when I was younger, there was a guy called Graham Smith who was a British champion and British record holder for the 1500 freestyle. He got bronze in Atlanta in 96 in the 1500 as well. And I remember being on a camp with him, and we did a set of 3100s on 145. And Graham was doing the set, and his coach, Dave, he wasn't timing him. Well, he was timing him in the background, but he wasn't telling him any times. He wasn't telling him any stroke rates that he was doing, none of it. And at the end of every repetition of all 30, he would ask him a different question, one of three. What time did you do? What was your stroke rate? And what were your splits? Now, he's asking him this not to guess, but Graham had practiced his pacing and his control and built his toolbox so big that he could do this set without having his coach tell him any of those three variables, the time, the splits, or the stroke rate. And he was getting within, we're talking margins of what the actual reality of those things were on every repetition. So we do the first 100 and he'd go 62.5, and then David asked him, Graham, what was your time? And he go 62.7. He goes, okay, good. And he would never give him proper feedback in terms of, oh, well, it was actually this. He would say, with it, I think their rule was within half a second either way was good, and anything else was like, nope, not close. And it was either one or the other. And then the next repetition, he'd say, what was your stroke rate? And Graham would say something like probably around a 42. And then he'd say, okay, good. Or if it wasn't even close, nope, not close. And then splits, he'd say, I don't know, 30.5 and 31.5 or something along those lines. And again, he'd do the same thing. But that was just such a great demonstration to me as an athlete at the time of how good people can get when it comes to learning how to pace and control their swims. And he just had this almost sixth sense about how fast he was actually going. He just knew purely by feel. And that's kind of almost the ultimate of where you can get to with this understanding. And then the final kind of point there is, as I've already mentioned, it's just allowing time. It takes a long time to develop this skill and to really hone it. It's lots of learning and lots of reflection. And that I think reflection is the key point there, that you've really got to be thinking about how you did, how you can maybe try to do it better next time, and identifying gaps when you possibly can. So some key principles to remember when it comes to pacing and learning to control races. Senior world-class swimmers can only maintain their maximum speed for approximately 6 seconds, which is an absolutely tiny margin. Because to swim at maximum speed means you've got to be working at your absolute maximum potential in terms of technique, in terms of energy usage. It's something that cannot be sustained. Slower speeds, as it gets slower and slower, can be sustained for longer. But think of it almost like a pyramid. The maximum speed and the maximum effort you're putting in is that top pinnacle of the pyramid. It's your fastest, but you can't sustain that for very long. And then as you get slower, it goes down, 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 and you can sustain that for longer. Okay? So from that thought process, for us, we need to learn how to use our energy effectively over a given distance. So whether it's from a 50 through to a 1500, we've got to learn over time how the principles of pacing and control of a race is affected and how it differs from one distance to the next. Okay. And the little image I've put here on the right hand side is the Brownlee brothers. You got Alistair and Johnny. And I was going to put a video of this on here, but I thought the image will do. But I put this on here because it's a great example of what happens when an athlete fully runs out of juice, in terms of runs out of energy, nothing left in the tank. They go into shutdown. And if you Google or you go on YouTube and type in Johnny Brownlee, I guess probably the best kind of finisher of that is Johnny Brownlee struggling to finish or something like that. If you type it in, there'll be a video in there for sure. It's from the World Championships a few years ago. And Johnny literally gets to the last 150 meters of the run phase of his triathlon, and his body starts shutting down. He starts losing his sense of direction. His energy is gone, and he basically starts collapsing. And then his brother Alistair, who was behind him, comes running up and storming up, and he ends up picking him up and helping him to the finish and basically pushing him over the line before he finished. So not only is that a great example of what happens when an athlete doesn't quite get the energy output right or the strategy of pace right throughout a race, and this is a very extreme example of a triathlon, which is an extreme endurance event compared to what we generally deal with in the swimming pool. But it's a great example of that, but also it's a great example of great competitive spirit and camaraderie between not just two brothers but competitors. His brother Alistair actually legitimately stopped and helped him and basically pushed him over the line ahead of him, so he to finish the race, which was a very admirable thing to do. So moving forward a little bit more into some more key principles. So the idea of going out and holding on is not an effective strategy in a race. I will caveat that with, apart from in cases, and I'll explain this more shortly, in terms of 50s, that is a little different. But anything from 100 meters plus, the idea of going out and at absolute everything you can and then holding on, it's not a very effective strategy in terms of racing. Now, you may have heard this from coaches, from other swimmers before, or even said it yourself, where I'm just going to go for it and see what happens. That's fair enough that you are brave enough to do that, but it's a bit of it's not a particularly effective way to swim a race. Now, the core method that we're going to talk about here for races that are 100 meters plus is something called building in quarters. Okay, you can break any race down into quarters to help you effectively manage your energy and build your energy and effort through a swim. Okay, so how do we build that? How do we build a swim? Which is effectively how we want to be approaching anything from 100 plus. Okay, we want to be building through that swim and really intensifying our energy use and our effort as we go through the swim. So we'll often hear something called even pace. Now, even pacing is a thing in terms of having your splits nice and even. Let's just use a 200, for example. The first 50 will always be a second to a second and a half, potentially quicker, because of the start, which is absolutely normal. But then the rest of the race, you want to try and keep your splits pretty much even. So let's just use an example of a 200 freestyle race. You might want to go 30 seconds on the first 50 and then 32, 32, 32. Now, that is basically classified as even splitting in terms of that second, third, and fourth 50. Okay? But if we were to say even pacing, it could be confusing, because fundamentally what it indicates is that there's an equal amount of energy exerted or used through the swim, which is not true. Okay? So if it was an equal amount of effort and energy that you were putting into every 50 meters, it was exactly the same, your pace will get slower and slower and slower because you're not increasing your energy as you go through the swim, and all of your momentum is starting to be lost. So fundamentally, we need to be building or increasing our effort, one and the same, as we go through a swim, which will result in our pace being nice and equal and our splits being equal through the race. Okay. Now, generally speaking, that's how we want to approach most swims. We want to try and keep that kind of second, third, and fourth quarter as equal to each other as we possibly can, factoring in short course, for example, or even long course with the transition from the second 25 to the third 25, that you have the turn in there, so you will have a natural increase in speed. So the split will be a bit faster in some cases with that, but those are little technicalities. But fundamentally, we want to try and keep even balance of our effort, our speed and intensity as we go through. So in order to do that, we absolutely must build and increase our effort as that swim goes on. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. So that fundamentally comes into this idea of building in quarters. So what does building in quarters look like for 100-meter plus events? So it's an effective way of teaching and learning how to pace races, and there's a simple little method you can bring into this in terms of statements that you can make to yourself as you go through, or a basic worded kind of progression as you go through these quarters. The first quarter is controlled. The second quarter is a hard effort, so it's a step up. The third quarter, which is normally the one fundamentally for us where in 200s, 400s in particular, in 1500s and 800s, this is where people trip up, is that they stop building and increasing their effort on that third 50 or third 100 or third 200 and 800. And most of you guys watching this have probably heard, whether it's me, Liam, or one of the other coaches say this before, that you've slowed down in the third 50 or third 100 or whatever it is. It's because that increase in effort hasn't been there the way it needs to be to keep it nice and balanced and even. But that third 50 needs to be very hard, and that final fourth 50 or fourth 100 fundamentally needs to be a big sprint. Now, depending on the distance, and this is the second point, those words mean different things for different events. Now, the final quarter of a 100-meter swim, where you were really going for it and sprinting into that finish with great skills and technique on top of that, because that's fundamentally going to be the big factor, that if you don't hold those skills and technique, you will slow down anyway, because the drag will increase. But if you're going for it on the back end of a 100 meters in terms of sprint, that will be very different to what it is on a 200, which is a full 50, or a 400, which is a full 100. It will look a little different and it will feel a little different, okay? So there are subtle differences as the distances go up, or vice versa as they go down, where those phrases that control hard, very hard, and almost that sprint effort at the end will mean very different things and will feel a little bit different. So you can't it's not just a one size fits all thing. It's a framework, but you need to understand and learn how those different events utilize that same concept. Okay. So fundamentally, the idea of building these quarters of a race and building through it using that controlled, hard, very hard, and sprint to the finish method or framework, it's quite an easy one to grasp. And at the start of this talk, I said straight up that the principles are simple of how to do this. And this is the principle. This is our baseline. So when it comes to events from 100 meters through to 1500 meters, you can easily go through them and look and break it down. So 100, it's 425s. And that concept is there even on long course. You can still utilize that. It doesn't have to be short course for that to work. You have 200, it's 450s. 400, it's 4 100s. 800, 4 200s. 1500, while it's not quite quarters, you can break it into fifths or into thirds. Same principle. Build through, control, hard, very hard. You can split one of those very hards and hards up a little bit, but as long as the principle of building and getting more intense is there all the way through, you'll get the gist. And you can break that into, say, 3 500s or 5 300s. The principles are all the same, okay? So building like this should be applied in training swims as well. So if we're doing it in training, we're getting into this habit of building through every swim. And it's, you can kind of expand on that. It's not just then about little swims, but when you also bring in other pacing methods, such as a descending set, for example, the principle stays the same, but as you go through the descending set, your starting point just changes. So let's use, for example, you did a descending set of 5 100s, and maybe you started on a minute 20, and then you went a minute 18, a minute 16, a minute 14, a minute 12. 2 seconds every time you got faster. So the principle on every 100 of that control hard, very hard sprint is still there, that building principle. Now, when you're going a 120 pace, that last 25, it won't be a sprint in that same terms that it would be if you were going absolutely all out in a race. This concept, it's the same, and it kind of works on this idea of just purely building, and those words are there for the race, that control through the sprint. Use that for the race, but you can still use that concept in training sets where you're doing, say, this little set of 5 100s of descending. You're building through every 25, so you get nice even pace of that 120. You move on. All you do is start that little bit faster on that first 25 meters controlled. It's that little bit more. Nice even building pace as you go through, keeps the energy balance nice and even. 118. move it up a little bit, 160, move it up a little bit, 140, 112. So hopefully that makes some sense. And you can apply that to everything. Whether it's a descending set like that, or whether it's a set of 10 100s where you're trying to hold the same time and using the same stroke rate, for example, the idea is still the same. You need to be building every repetition, and that's not, and if it's descending, then we use that principle. But if it's just trying to hold the same pace all the way through, you've got to build every rep, because if you don't build, like I said earlier on, your pace will drop off by not building. Building and building those quarters, that will help you maintain a nice even pace. Okay? Hopefully that point isn't too labored. So a couple of key points to note. As swimmers advance, this basic method, can be used to build race models. So essentially put together specific splits for that swimmer as they get older and they start understanding. And then obviously looking at what specific race pace targets can be used in training. So this whole thing doesn't have to be complicated, but what the message of that first statement is that you've got to get the basics right. And this basic foundation here that I'm talking about building quarters, if you lock that in, if you're using that all the time, you learn to understand that and you give it time to really sink in. What you can then do is start understanding how you need to race. And as you get older, when I start asking you for more input on that particular part, we start building new elements into it that makes it a little bit more advanced for you, then you can start having input into that. But fundamentally, like I said about elite swimmers, you don't want to make this process complicated. Master the fundamentals of race strategy and control. Then you can start looking at how to make it that little bit more advanced every time. And what's important to note is going in and making several changes and making several more advanced parts of this, it's not the way forward. Making one tweak, something that little bit different every training cycle or every season or however you want to approach it, get better at that one little thing every single time, and that will bring better results than trying to do several things at once, which we all know we can't do. Okay, so the second point there is when considering your race, the first quarter will generally be faster due to the start and the energy that comes along with being fresh. So in terms of that first part, whether it's the first 25 of 100 or first 50 or first 100 of a 400, you're generally a little bit fresher than you will be at the end of the race, which will be true. It is a slightly different energy system to an extent as well, depending on what event you're doing. So you've always just got to take into account that you will generally be faster, and you should generally be faster because of the start and just that freshness at the start of the race. So don't worry too much about the opening part of the race. As long as you are controlled and you're working great skills and you're moving through it in a good way, then you don't need to overly worry about or think too much about the first 50 meters. And like I said, the more advanced and the more educated with this you get, you will start to learn what it feels like for you to go out nice and smooth and controlled in that first 50 and still be very fast without being too overly energetic about it. And the final point there is using other pacing methods in training, such as things like negative split, also have high value in that they emphasize building and strongly finishing in the back of the swim. So things like, you can take this idea of building quarters, and that's kind of it's a race strategy, it's a basic strategy for everything. But when negative split gets put on there, for example, is that there's still going to be an element of that building quarters, but the second half is really emphasized. And for me, when I put negative split on, for me, it's not so much about just plastering that last 50 and not doing anything on the first 50. You still need to have this idea of building the quarters, but you're putting more of the emphasis on the second half of the swim that is teaching you and focusing you into how to finish strongly at the back, and then going into a point I made previously about applying that to skills, and then gives you the opportunity to practice proper skills on that race finish and finish properly every single time under a little bit of pressure and a little bit of extra power. So hopefully that makes some sense. So 50 meters, okay? We're going to call this the exception to the idea of building quarters, because fundamentally it's very difficult to look at 50 and go, how do you build quarters? But 50 meter events as in general are a bit of a different animal. So, we'll go through this process here and talk about 50s a little bit. So in terms of 50 meter events, they do sit as an exception, as the skills within the 50 in terms of how to properly attack them and work through them they are a skill on their own, and it's a skill that needs to be developed and mastered. 50s aren't, they're not a particularly easy event to get right. And I will emphasize this. And, there's always the eternal argument of, oh, well, distance swimmers are tougher than 50 swimmers and all of this. But 50s are very, very challenging events. The higher up the ranks that you get and the older you get. Yes, a lot of people tend to do them, but a lot of people tend to see them as easy and an easy option and an easy way to get county times and things like that, which is fundamentally irrelevant. Swimming a 50 at a high level in terms of performance, when I say high level, I don't mean having to be elite. I mean, I'm talking performing to your absolute physical best in a 50-meter event is very challenging, and it needs to be developed and mastered, the skill of doing that event itself. So fundamentally, 50 swims, they need to be an all-out effort. No, they do. They need to be everything that you can provide in that swim, because it is such a short amount of time and a short distance. But fundamentally, the goal that you have within that all-out effort is trying to achieve your maximum swimming speed as quickly as you possibly can with proper technique. So the way you can swim your fastest speed, your maximal speed, is with correct technique, which will lower the amount of drag that you end up facing, or the amount of energy, that you have to use to overcome that drag that you're going up against. Because the faster you get, the equal amount of drag that goes up with you, and you've got to use energy to overcome that drag. Okay, so proper technique is absolutely essential in 50-meter swimming. Absolutely essential. And I'm sure we've all seen swimmers and swims where technique seems to go out of the window, and doesn't matter how big or strong that person is, at some point in their career, the lack of technique will catch them up, and it will catch them out, and they will really struggle to go faster. Because fundamentally, at some point or other, you've got to have those skills to overcome the effects of drag. So fundamentally, 50s, it's about getting to your maximum speed after the underwater and after the start as quickly as you possibly can within the first handful of strokes. Okay, and we'll talk about those first few strokes in a minute and what other elements are important in order to help you achieve that maximum speed. So the third point there is, fundamentally, and as we've already said, you can only hold your maximum speed for a very short amount of time. So elite athletes, generally around 6 seconds. Now, so you've got a small window to get to that speed and a very small window to actually maintain that at some level, and then it will start coming down. You will slow down. There's an old phrase saying it's all about who slows down the least, who wins the race. Now, with sprint events, 100%, that is absolutely imperative, and it's such a defining statement, I think, of the event. So as we can only hold that speed for a small amount of time, our focus after that shot, once we hit that maximum speed, needs to absolutely be on how we minimize the speed in which we lose our speed that we're swimming at. So your back end of your race becomes about, how can I lose as little speed as I possibly can with great technique, and hopefully with great training and the ability to do that. So hopefully that makes some sense. And the final point, and this is something I know that I say, and I know Liam's really passionate about, and has always been very, very vocal about, with not just with sprint events, but just generally, is that when we go into our underwater and then into the breakout, it is absolutely imperative that we always build the first 3 to 6 strokes that we do, in order to, one, set ourselves up and get to our maximum speed, because with proper technique and proper hold of the water and consistent hold of the water, we will get to our maximum speed. Okay. And then secondly, it's to stop us from spinning our wheels and spinning our arms around like crazy, slipping the water and not getting any catch or any feel for that water. Okay. And again, that is a skill that you need to be honing and training and really locking into. And it's one that we see a lot where people ignore it in training and then feedback to us after a race, well, I didn't feel the water. Well, how often in training are you actually focusing in on that and making a point of building those first 3 to 6 strokes? Okay, so you can see here that there's 2 distinct splits in terms of this idea of race strategy and race control. 50 is a whole being and planet on its own that takes its own skills that need to be mastered and developed. 100 meters plus, the idea of building quarters massively comes into that. 2 really simple elements, and hopefully this slide here is giving you a simple understanding of some really easy ways to develop your 50-meter events in terms of strategy. Okay, But again, these things are simple, and it's putting these things into practice as frequently as you possibly can. So just to kind of finish off now, a couple of key points on kicking and pulling within all of this. I'm just gonna, just realized my screen's in the way here. That's fine. So I'm just gonna put all these up. There we go. So in terms of kick, okay, across all events, with the slight exception of 50-meter events. Key points here with kick is that it always needs to be controlled, and we need to build our kicking. Okay, it's absolutely essential for proper race pace during freestyle and backstroke racing. Now, I'll skip to a bottom point on this slide, that fly and breaststroke, it is a bit different because kicking plays a more significant role in the actual technique and force generation of the stroke, and breaststroke and fly, the idea there is slightly different. So this is more emphasizing freestyle and backstroke here. But building the kick, just like we've talked about building the quarters in our general swim pacing in general, is massively important. So kicking plays two key functions within our stroke. Firstly, it helps there to balance and stabilize our stroke. And secondly, it helps influence our stroke rate. Now, the slower you kick, the harder it is for you to increase your stroke rate. It will feel more unnatural. But as your kick rate increases, your ability to increase your stroke rate, with the key here of still maintaining your stroke length, the length of your stroke while that rate goes up, that's what kicking harder and faster allows us to do. And that's important to build up as we go through a race as well. Okay. Third point is, as we focus on building our kick through the event, it helps us conserve energy at the start and really utilize that higher stroke rate at the end. And it allows us to keep balanced and stable at the end of the race as well. So it helps us save and conserve energy with that. And it also helps us, like I say, increase that rate without losing the stroke length. And I put this massive bold here. This does not mean at the start of a race that you don't kick. Okay, you need to learn how to shift through gears of your kick. Stabilize and balance at the beginning, and then start increasing that intensity as you go through on free and backstroke to make sure you can then gently increase your stroke rate as you go through that building of quarters phase. Okay. Last little bit here. So in terms of technique and stroke rate, so technique should always remain the same as you increase your effort and speed. Okay, it should always remain the same. You shouldn't start doing different things when your speed goes up. You know, if you look at sprint events, there are slightly different techniques as you get older that you can implement that is relevant to 50-meter swimming or even 100-meter swimming in terms of recovery positions or pull positions in the water. But whatever you practice in training, you need to transfer that into the race. It should not change. Okay, no matter what your effort level is, no matter what your speed level is, race the same way that you have practiced. Okay, now if it needs to change and evolve, we'll do that in the training pool. Okay, and then moving forward, as we build through, you can absolutely build your stroke rate, but in a nice, smooth manner. It should never be from 0 to 100 in like snap of fingers, but it's always essential that your stroke count stays as consistent as possible. Now, you can maintain your stroke count or within a good level of where your stroke count starts while you increase your stroke rate. That's part of having great efficiency and great technique in the water, but also the fact that we've mentioned before, you're using that extra kicking on free and back in particular to make sure that you are maintaining that length of stroke while increasing that rate of turnover. Okay, so increasing your stroke rate definitely reduces efficiency, okay, which increases the energy you use to push through the water to try and overcome the drag forces. So some key points here is making sure that your stroke technique absolutely remains the same when you're building your effort. Again, just because you're working harder and harder and putting more effort in doesn't mean that you start doing all sorts of different techniques. It's got to stay the same. It's got to stay consistent. It's got to be there under pressure, which is why we train technique so much and so we emphasize it so heavily. It'll be difficult to begin with, but again, this idea of allowing time and reflection to think about how you've done it, how you could do it better next time, and it will help you pick the skill up quickly. Now, quickly could mean many different things. Quickly is not going to be over one day. We're talking months, years. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of thought about what you're doing. But fundamentally, guys, the faster swimmers, and I'm talking the people who get the most out of themselves, swim their fastest, are masters of this. They're masters of great skills, great technique, performing under pressure with the correct stroke and using their stroke rate to their advantage. So fundamentally, getting into the habit of counting your strokes and noticing how it reacts when you increase your stroke rate is massively important. So just to wrap things up then, in terms of what we've covered in this talk today is, 4 key points. The first one, principles of effective race control and building strategy are simple, but this does not make them easy. Okay, they are hard work. They take a lot of thought, but the principles and the foundations of it are very simple strategies. Building in quarters for anything 100 meters plus is an easy and simple fundamental strategy that you can use at all times. Okay, it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. As you get older, and on the third point there, as you learn fundamentals of control and strategy and training and put them into practice, you can use them consistently, and you can also start adding extra detail on there as you get older and more understanding of how you need to utilize that. Okay, and the closing point here is make sure you give it time and always reflect on what you observe and what you learn. Okay, even negative experiences in training or in racing are great teachers. In fact, negative experiences are the greatest teachers. So don't just learn from the things that go well, learn from the things that don't, because you will learn from everything. It's all about how you frame it and all about your mindset. If you turn yourself off to learning, then it's not going to get any better. But even in the hardest moments where you feel frustrated or angry or whatever it is, learn from those situations and you'll move forward. So guys, hopefully that this has been informative in some way for you. Obviously, if there's any more questions, let me know, and I'll try and fill in any gaps. So hopefully that's given you a little bit more understanding of race control and strategy, and we'll see you next week for the next workshop. Thank you.